Hey guys, and welcome to another Blender Cookie tutorial. My name is Greg Zaal, and today we're going to be doing part 2 of the visual effects tutorial series. Last time in part 1 we finished off modeling and texturing and lighting the safe and the platform and everything, and that gave us something like this. Okay, and today we're going to be taking this and putting it into our footage. So I'll just cancel that render by pressing the Z key, or Z, and I'm going to go into the movie clip editor. Now, we just need to open up our footage, so we click open down there, and we go and find our footage, which is somewhere over here. And to open the footage, we just select the first image of the image sequence. I prefer to work from image sequences when doing tracking and stuff, because it's faster than the original movie file as an AVI or whatever. I'm not sure why, but it is. So, we have our image sequence here. We just select the first one and we say open clip, but I've already got it loaded, so I'll cancel that and select it over here. Okay, so as you can see, we have our footage here and we need to start tracking. So I'm going to go to the beginning of the frames by holding in shift and pressing the left arrow key. To add a tracker, or a marker as I think they're called, you hold in control and click. It's that simple. And basically you want to add markers where it's a unique point in that area, something like a corner or anything. Like you wouldn't add a tracker somewhere over there, because it's exactly the same as that point and that point and that point, and it's not going to track it very well. So I'll put it here in this corner. And what we're going to do, because this is some blurry footage, because I don't have the best camera, we're going to show the pyramids here. And we're going to go down into the tracker settings, and we're on KLT trackers, and I'm going to increase the pyramid levels. And that just helps when you have blurry footage and it's not as easy to track and things. You can't see that it's blurry now, but later on you'll see. Okay, and that's one thing to remember, that it's very good if you have lots of lighting when you're filming things. Otherwise you'll have blurry footage, and it's really annoying to track something that's always blurry. In fact, it's pretty much impossible. So we have that here, and to track we just press Ctrl T, and it will do its magic, and when it loses the track, you see it's blurry here, it'll stop. And at that point we just got to press G and move it back into place. And one thing that helps us, if we say lock to selection, it moves the marker into the middle of the screen and it will stay there. Okay. Another way to track is to hold in the Alt key and use the arrow keys to track forward and back. So right will go forward and left will go back. So I'll go right and forward, and there we go, it keeps going. Now this is a bit slower, but it's useful when you're not sure if it's going to always track properly. Okay, so I think it's working pretty well, so I'm going to hit Ctrl T again, which is faster, and it just lost the track again. So I'll put it back and do it again. Okay. So now you get the basic idea. If I carry on, it's probably going to slip sometime. What I mean by slip is that it goes off the place where you want it. If you remember, we originally put the marker somewhere over there in the corner, and all of a sudden it's over here now, later on. It's not a big deal if it slips like a small amount like that, because we're going to be adding lots of trackers and, well, markers, and it will, it'll calculate the right thing, and it'll work out in the end. But if it slips a lot, say it goes to somewhere like there, you'll just have to move it back and carry on. So it's no big deal. Okay, and that is that. So I'm just going to pause this recording here and track the rest of the footage. Alright, so I've finished tracking the scene here, and as you can see, I've placed some markers like over there and on all of these things here. Now these markers are actually physical pieces of tape that I've put on the table and put an X on them with a permanent marker, and there we go. So basically, one thing to note is that when you're tracking these sort of manual markers, as you can see down here, I've put the marker right in the middle of the X there, and I had a little bit of trouble tracking this properly, and the reason for that is because if you look here, that little X part here is very similar to where the other lines meet and form a sort of an X, so the tracker doesn't really know the difference between that part and that part, so sometimes it will jump around and not track properly. So I learned from that, and on the next one I tracked it up in a corner here on a sort of empty space here, because it's very different from any of the other parts. And also on these things, these little pieces of blue tack or press stick, I've placed the marker on the right of the blob here instead of in the middle, because in the middle it's very similar. If I show you, like this part over here is very similar to this part here, so it tends to slip around a lot inside the white part. And that's basically all I have to say. Well, also, it's very difficult or virtually impossible to solve the camera properly if you only have markers in 2 dimensions. As you can see, all of these markers here are in 2 dimensions on this flat table here. So that wouldn't have tracked properly, it wouldn't have solved the camera properly if I didn't add these markers on top of the newspaper here as well. And the newspaper is just a little bit higher than on the table, but it seems to figure it out and it works out in the end. Also, I've added a marker right over there by the punch over here, and that's a little off the table as well, so that helps it. You have to have markers in all 3 dimensions, otherwise it usually doesn't work properly. Okay, so now we're pretty much ready to solve the camera. So I'm going to go and switch or split it into the 3D viewport here, and basically we just need to select the camera and reset all the transformations. So basically press Alt R to reset rotation, Alt S to reset scale, and Alt G, I think it is, yes, to reset location. Okay, so the camera is right in the origin there, and it's all default. Okay, and then we need to go into the Constraints tab while we've selected the camera and add a camera solver. And then we go back into the tracker here, or the movie clip editor, and we can start solving it. There's basically 2 things you need to change, or 2 sets of things you need to change before you're ready to solve it, and that is these keyframes here. Now basically these keyframes, you want to have them in between, or making a selection of a set of frames where the camera is moving, sort of, well, it's actually moving, it's not just rotating. In other words, you're physically walking around and not standing still and rotating the camera. That's basically what you need to have. So I found that the keyframe range of between 1 and 85 seemed to work perfectly fine. Okay, and the second thing you need to do is the camera data. Now, I found on this camera that the good settings to use are 30 for the focal length and 35 for the sensor width. The things I found on the internet, they said that the sensor width should be like 6 millimeters and the focal length should be like 28 or something, but I found those didn't work at all. So, just by trial and error, I found out that those 2 work fine. And basically we can leave all the rest of the distortions and everything else alone, and yeah, we can solve it. So we can click this solve camera motion button right here, and it will do completing solution until 100%. And there we go. Now as you can see, it shows us our average solve error down here, and it is 0.8557, which is good, I think. When I was doing tests a few months ago, I got an average solve error of like 3 million, and that was with those sensor widths of like 6 and 28 over there. So that was obviously wrong. And that's good, I think that's done it. Now if we go into the camera view, and we play the animation, the camera moves around, but in obviously the wrong way. And basically, if I just go back and turn on the motion tracking, that should be on by default, and go to layer 2 so it's empty, you can see that all the markers are appearing to be in the right place. Oh, and if you don't see the background image here, you just got to go into the camera tracker and say set as background under clip there. Anyway, so you'll see your markers here. They are probably just plain axes like that, but I prefer to work with them as spheres, and I've just made them really small. Whoa, okay, there we go. Just because it doesn't give you an idea of the orientation. Well, it doesn't show you where they're pointing. Anyway, So it looks fine here, and if we play the animation, they all seem to stay in the right place, and they're not moving around or anything like that, and it's working fine. But the only problem is, if I turn on the grid floor again, and maybe these two axes, you can see that this is kind of very weird. And basically, to fix that, we just go and we hit Tab in the movie clip editor to go to reconstruction, and we can start setting some things up. Basically, we can select 3 of these markers and say set floor and orientation, and that will put them and set them as the floor. And then it's a good idea to set the origin and select another one to set one of the axes. And if you like, you can set a scale as well, but I'm going to be tweaking that later, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, and that is that done. Now I'm going to re-enable my first layer, which is the cycle stuff, and start positioning things. Basically, I'm going to put the cursor in the middle, which I think it is already, so Shift S, cursor to center, and it's there already, and then hit the full stop key on the keyboard to put the pivot point to the 3D cursor. And that means if I select the camera, I can scale it, and it will basically do that. Now here it looks like it's doing what we think it would, but in the camera view it looks like it's doing something different, but it's doing the right thing. Anyway, so I'm just going to go to a frame like this, so I can see where the front of the safe is, and I can rotate it like that, and then just move it around. And I'm pressing G and Shift Z to move it only on the flat axes like that. Okay, and some way about there is right. Maybe I'll scale it up a little bit more. Let's just see. Yeah, that's about right. And what we want is to cover up the markers, these markers on the ground here, so that it'll save us from having to cover it up later. That's what we'll be doing in part 3, is basically just covering up those markers over there. What you could do, if you're feeling lazy, is add something into the scene, like, I don't know, a cup or a bag, or anything, any object, to just cover that marker so we don't see it. But we're going to be doing it the hard way, and we'll get to that in part 3. So basically, we just want to cover up these markers here with the platform so that we don't have to do that later. And I think that's fine. So, that is the tracking done. At this point, you could render out the cycles animation, but we've got a few things to do. In fact, we might as well do it right now, just to save our time. So basically, later on we're going to be making reflections. And to make the reflections, it's very simple. At least my method of doing it. It's probably not the best, and it doesn't work in all cases, but it works very well in this case. I'm going to go into edit mode of this object, and select the vertex way down here, and say cursor to selected, and then hit Ctrl L to select the linked object, and I'll just go into wireframe mode and deselect that because we don't want it. And yep, that's it. And then I'm just going to duplicate this and scale along the z-axis by -1. And just make sure you're using the cursor point as the pivot point, otherwise that probably won't work so well. Anyway, so we're basically making our reflection by physically duplicating this object and making the reflection an actual object. Now because I'm using shape keys to animate this, we can't simply go press P and say separate selection, because it's going to tell us you can't separate mesh with shape keys. So what we need to do for that is just duplicate this object and then delete that, and then the other one press Ctrl I to select everything else and delete that. So now we've effectively got these two objects separately. There we go. And there we go, that's our reflection. So at this point we could render out our cycles animation by clicking it there, and preferably render it to an image sequence of PNGs in a place that we know where it is, and that'll be cool. But I'm not going to do that right now because it would take me about a week to render it. So I'm going to go and we can start with the node editing, and this is the fun part. Okay, now these are basically what we did last time in part 1. I think, if that's the right object. No, it's not. It's a different object. Anyway, so we did something similar to that in part 1. I'm going to go into the render nodes and turn on backdrop. And I've deleted all the nodes here, so we can go ahead and add in our image sequence. So basically add an image and open it. And I'm going to go and find our footage, which I believe is probably somewhere where I put it. There we go. Here. And once again, just open the first image and click open. And then we say set it as a image sequence and change it to 450 frames and turn on auto refresh, which basically automatically refreshes the preview of it every time you change frames, which is nice. So I'm going to add in a viewer node so that when we control shift click something, it will automatically connect it to the viewer. Also, I'm going to press N and change the zoom so we can actually see what we're doing. Okay, and now yes, we need to import our cycles render. Now, I don't have the original cycles render. I must have misplaced it somewhere. I don't know where it is, but I've re-rendered some frames, like frame 255, and it looks something like that. So what we want to do is basically layer this one over on top of this one. But if we do that, as you can see, for one, this isn't a PNG image. Well, it doesn't have an alpha pass. So if we just put it on there, it's going to just override it, because this part is still part of the image. It's not actually transparent. But also what we're going to get is these doors that have slid out to the side and should be underneath the table, and also the shaft of the elevator. And to fix that, we're going to be needing to add a ground plane, which we'll also need for the shadows and everything. So this ground plane will act as a mask that we can use to layer only this part, only the platform and the safe on top of the footage here. So to do that, we're going to go back into the 3D viewport. I can get rid of this now. And on layer 2, I'm going to put the cursor in the center and add a plane. I can see that layer again, and it should be in the middle. Yep, right in between the reflection and the non-reflected object. And yes, so I'm going to go into top view and move it roughly in the middle of there. And now, because our ground plane our ground plane needs to have a hole in it, otherwise it's going to cover up the elevator shaft. So basically I'm just going to add some loop cuts like that and scale along the x-axis until it's on the edges of the platform, like that. And then I can just delete this face in the middle, and we can still see down the elevator shaft. And then I'm going to select all of these edge loops on the side and just scale them up as much as you like. In fact, preferably as much as you can, so it'll be as realistic to the horizon as possible. And luckily in this video, we don't actually look at the horizon, so it doesn't matter how big our ground plane is. If your footage did look at the horizon, you would just have to check your ambient occlusion pass so that you don't see like a grey line on the horizon. But that's a very simple fix. Anyway, so lucky for us, we don't have to do that. Now that we have our ground plane, what we're going to be using is the object index pass. So now we have to switch to Blender Internal and just select object index. Now currently the SVN build of Blender does have render passes and cycles, but because we're using the ambient occlusion pass and all of that stuff for the shadows, we might as well use the object index pass from Blender Internal as well, because it renders quicker as well. So I'll select object index, and then with the ground plane selected, we can go into the object tab here, and we change the pass index to 1. And basically the pass index and the object index pass lets you have a mask, basically. So by putting this on 1, if we tell the node editor to use the pass index of 1, then we'll see white where the ground plane is and black where the ground plane is not, which is here. And that's perfect for the mask we need to composite our stuff properly. And that will also help us when we're doing stuff like shadows and reflections. So that's good. And now that we're here and we're about to render it, we can go and enable the ambient occlusion pass, and that's going to be used for shadows. And then of course we need to actually enable ambient occlusion and put it on multiply and on a factor of 1. And now because this is on multiply, we need to have some source of light, and I'm just going to use the environment lighting and put it on 1 and white color. And the default samples of 6 is a little bit too low. It's a little bit grainy and noisy and doesn't look so great, so I'm going to put it on 12. And that's going to increase our render times a lot, but it's no big deal. It's just Blender internal. And also, I'm not sure why that's still like that. I'm sure I deleted it. We'll do that well right now actually, because we have these materials from cycles. Go away. These cycles materials, they're using nodes, and Blender doesn't really understand these node systems, so when you render it, it will just appear invisible, and not just invisible, but with an alpha value, so it could mess things up quite a bit. So basically what we can do is add a new material and call it, what I called it, clay, like that. And that's just the default material. I haven't done anything to it, and that's because we don't really care about what the material is, what it looks like. We just care that it's a Blender material, and thus the ambient occlusion and all the other passes will work properly. So then we go into our render layers, and I have the default render layer. I've just named it something different, and we can select our clay material. As you can see, I've done some experimenting recently, which is why I have lots of different copies. So there we go, that's the right clay material, and everything should render properly. So I'm going to render frame 255, because that's the frame I used from the nodes over here, because I don't have any of the other frames, because I must have deleted them. Anyways, that's my fault. Back to the 3D viewport, and I can render that image. Okay, so that's rendered nicely. Let's get back to the nodes. Alright, so to add the shadows, basically, well actually before we add the shadows we need to use the mask. So I'm going to add the render layers, and as you can see, if I Control-Shift-click this node, it loads the first image there, and if I click it again, it loads the alpha pass, and the Z pass, and the speed, don't remember clicking that, and the ambient occlusion, and finally the object index. And by default the object index is 0 unless we change it. Let me quickly, before I forget, I must have accidentally turned that on. Anyway, so there's our object index pass, and that's exactly what we want. And you can just press V, by the way, to zoom out, and Alt V to zoom in. Or you can do it over here. But anyway, so with the object index pass, we can now add a mix node. That's not a mix node, a mix node, and plug that into the factor value, and then we can plug one of these in here and this one in there. And I have a feeling it's the wrong way around. Yes, it is. So I'll just swap it, and there we go. It's as simple as that. But obviously it's not as simple as that, because now we need to add in the shadows and the reflections, and we need to do some color correction, because our original scene here, as you can see, is rather yellowy and sort of slightly greenish, and that's just because of the fluorescent lighting and the white balance of the camera. So basically, to fix that, it's very simple. We can add a color balance node right there, and drop it on there, and I'm going to make it very yellowy, like this, and the last one will be green. And if you don't know, this color balance node, the left wheel controls the dark areas, and the right wheel controls the light areas, and the middle one controls all of that in between. And basically that's obviously too much, so I'm going to change the factor down to 0.5. And that's about the right color, I think. Okay, and now for the shadows. All we need to do is take our ambient occlusion pass and multiply it over. So once again, a mix node, I'm going to change it to multiply and plug the ambient occlusion pass into the bottom, and that should be fine. Now, one thing you probably noticed is that it's still applying the ambient occlusion onto the rest of all these objects. And now that's not necessarily realistic because Cycles has done all the lighting and shading and all that good stuff that we want. So we don't want to add extra shadows in that we don't need. So once again, all we're going to do is use that object index pass as a mask and plug it in there. And that's done it perfectly, I think. Didn't expect it to work first time. Yeah. If it doesn't work and it doesn't look like it's working properly in whatever you're doing, you might have the object index inverted. All you got to do is add an invert node, and that'll just swap the black and white colors, and it should work fine. And one more thing, we want to adjust the ambient occlusion so that it's a little darker towards the start here, because I don't think it's working as well as it should, and basically make the rest of the scene lighter, because if you take a look at this, the ambient occlusion has made this a little bit darker too. Just a little bit. It's very difficult to see. So to do that, we'll just add a color ramp, drop it on there, and change this white. Why isn't that working? Oh yes, we gotta plug in the image. You'll notice Blender tries to connect the nodes for you when you drop it on, and obviously it'll connect the grey dot with the other grey dot, but we actually want the white one. Anyway, so I'm going to just move this black part up quite a bit, not that much though. That should make some of it darker, and I'll move this white part in, and that should help as well. Is it doing anything? Yes, it is. And then I'm going to add one in between and just move it up. And I think that's doing something. I hope it is. And it doesn't look like it is. That's not very nice. Whoa, let's plug it back in there. Oh, I'm using the object index. Oh, that's actually the wrong one. I need to go and take it, duplicate this onto the ambient occlusion one. I was busy editing the wrong pass. Okay, and that's what we wanted to do. So, I'm not sure if you can see, but if I just plug this into there quickly, it's a little bit lighter. And if I do this again, ambient occlusion to there and that to there, you can see it's a bit darker, and that's kind of what we want. I think that's about right. Great. And that's the shadows done. And the next thing we're going to do is the reflections. And that's a little bit more complicated, but it's much the same thing using all our passes and things like that. And how we're going to do that is we need a mask to mask out our original render over here. So if you look down over there, wrong way, like this, you can see that this little piece here is what's being reflected, and you'll hardly see it, but it does make a difference. So let's just go back out to 1, and maybe zoom out a little more. Okay. So in order to do that, we're going to need a little bit of mask, and in order to get the mask, we're going to be using render layers. And basically, we're going to have the first render layer, which is pretty much everything exactly as it is here, but the second render layer is going to be our reflection. Okay, and this render layer is only going to render layer 3, and we have nothing on layer 3 at the moment, but layer 3 is simply this object there, the reflected object. So I'm going to move that to layer 3. So, this all layer, we don't want it to render all of them. We can render layers 1 and 2 only, but it shouldn't matter because it wouldn't even be able to see that anyway because it's under the ground plane. But just as good practice. Okay, and that's that. We can render it again. And there we are. So basically, if you look down here, we can change the layer to reflection, and it's completely invisible. And the reason for that is because we have to remember that these objects are using the Cycles materials, and basically you have to set a render layer by render layer. So we have to select reflection, and you can see it doesn't have the clay there, whereas this one does. So basically just select clay, and we can re-render. And here we have it. So basically this is our reflection pass, and you can see the old pass is still exactly the same, but we have this extra thing here. And what we're going to be using is the alpha pass to make our mask. So back to the nodes. Everything should still look the same. There we go. And now we can add our new render layer over here. That's not one. In fact, let me just duplicate this and change it to reflection. And this one, we're going to be using the alpha pass, which will look something like that, and do something quite simple with it. So I'm going to add a mix node over here, and just drop it, well, put it over there on the front. We can put that there and drop that on that. There we go. And then take our original render and plug it in here. And then take the alpha pass and use it as a FAC value. And as you can see, that's worked perfectly fine, except obviously the reflection is solid now. You can barely see it, but it's there. And what it's also done is, well, what I've done is I've taken it from here before we color corrected it. So basically I just want to take this and put it over here instead, so the colors are all right again. Okay, and that's that. Now to adjust the transparency of the reflection so it's not completely reflective, as you can see there, we just need to add a color ramp again, drop it on here, and remember it takes the gray dot, which is not what we want, put the image over there, and we just want to take this white value and make it a gray color, and that will make it less transparent. And that is the reflection done. You can see it here. It's very, very faint, but it is important that it's there. It's hard to notice, but it's important. So that's basically this tutorial done. In the next part, like I said earlier, we're going to be covering up those markers that we can see. Well, actually, we can't see them in this frame because they're hiding behind that, and the ones just down there off the screen. Anyway, we'll be covering up those markers, and that'll be pretty fun. So, thanks again for watching this tutorial. My name is Greg Zaal, and goodbye.